Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started out of procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today on the show, I am joined by 4 different guests. I think that's a first for the Art of Procurement podcast, who are all good friends of the show and published authors. We are joined by Joe Payne, Bill Dorn, Dave Pastore, and Jenn Ulrich of Corcentric to discuss their new book, the second edition of Managing Indirect Spend, Enhancing Profitability Through Strategic Sourcing. In this pod, we'll deep dive into the new book. We'll explore what they're seeing in the field when it comes to what not to do in the strategic sourcing process, how to think about the technology landscape and selecting the right tools for the right jobs, and how sourcing project complexity can drive organizational design. Now, I jump into the call by giving each one of my guests the opportunity to introduce themselves, and I start with posing the question to Jenn.
Sure. Hi, Phil. Thanks for having us today. This definitely covers an item on my bucket list to be on the AOP podcast. So thank you. So I've been with Corcentric for just about 12 years, leading an advisory team. And before I kind of got into the advisory side of things in terms of helping to elevate the role of procurement, I spent a lot of time in strategic sourcing, and it was just sort of a natural evolution to help organizations, based on what we had learned, working with procurement functions and seeing what worked and what didn't work to kind of take it to the next step. So it's kind of where I am here, but very excited to work with you today.
Thanks. Bill, I'm going to hand over to you.
So I'm Senior Vice President of Product Operations for Corcentric. And been here about 3 years. And prior to that, Joe and I used to co-run Source One Management Services, which was a consulting firm specifically focused on, procurement and strategic sourcing advisory. And we were there for about 15 years. Before that, I was a mechanical engineer and quality assurance and get my hands dirty type of person in the shop floor. So my role now is focused on supporting the order to cash and source to pay solution set here at Corcentric and making sure that, really I got a pulse on what the market's asking for so we can take product direction in the right way.
Thanks, Bill. And Dave, I'm going to hand over to you next.
All right, thanks, Phil. It's really a pleasure to be on the show. My name's Dave Pastore. I head up our strategic sourcing consulting group here at Corcentric, and for 15 years, I've been helping mid-size and large enterprises realize their procurement objectives. So really looking forward to what we've kind of turned that type of experience into in this book.
Thank you, Dave. And last but not least, Joe.
Hi, Phil. Great to be here. I'm Joe Payne, SVP of Global Delivery at Corcentric. I manage our consulting and advisory teams, our professional services group, and our managed services group. And we help our customers go through large-scale transformations tied to finance and procurement.
Well, collectively, you all you wrote the book together. Now, Joe and Bill, you worked on the first edition 10 years ago, I think now, which is kind of crazy. So my first question really for you, Joe, is why now? Why is now the time for a second edition?
Sure. And just as an FYI, Bill and I were the authors on the last edition, but Jennifer and Dave actually contributed chapters 10 years ago as well. So, why did we do this edition? Well, first, let me start with why we actually wrote the first edition. Because 10 years ago, when we were talking to customers, we were actually still talking to them about what strategic sourcing was and what the value strategic sourcing could bring to their organizations. So even though it's been around a long time, in a lot of organizations, it wasn't a well-known process, particularly as it tied to indirect spend. And so at that time, there really wasn't a lot out there on indirect spend. We saw a gap and we wanted to fill it. So 10 years have passed. And for me in particular, between 2010 and 2020, there was so much talk around Procurement 2020, and oh my God, look at the value procurement can bring we're gonna be able to do so much by 2020, and bids are just going to automatically go out, and there's going to be all this AI, and the function's going to be so highly recognized. And yet we're still struggling. And that's part of the reason why we wrote the book, is because 10 years later, we have the same problems. It's just 10 years older. So things have changed. Certainly things have changed. It's much more well-known function. And a lot of organizations, it's a much more mature function than it was 10 years ago. We've built it up, which is great. Technology is now a mandated necessity, when before it was kind of a nice to have, which is another big change. But, for us, it was, how do we bring those things into today's environment? So mature organizations trying to find technology, thinking about building or centralizing a procurement team. These are all new concepts that we've brought into the second edition to reflect where we're at today as a function.
Now, the book is really written in 4 parts. We talk about the strategic sourcing process to start with, looking at tools and technology. You talked a little bit about that, Joe. Then going into some examples from the field, just from all of your experiences, before talking about organizational design. I want to touch on just a few of those different elements as we go through the conversation today. Now, the first area is that process. And you go into an awful lot of detail on the strategic sourcing process. And I don't necessarily want to go into that detail in the show today, because it's something that, folks who haven't necessarily been around a formal strategic sourcing process, they can go and take the book and have a look at that. But there's a few little elements that I wanted to pull out and just pose some questions. And the first one is around, and I'm going to, I'll pose this, Jenn, for you to start with, and then of course anybody else can kind of join in as well. We talk in the book around getting sponsorship for strategic sourcing projects and for getting early engagement. I just wonder, what are some of the things that you recommend, that you see kind of in the field on a daily basis, or ways that procurement teams are successful in starting to get sponsorship when you may not have had sponsorship in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty major challenge, especially for organizations that are just starting out. And like you said, they don't necessarily have that established sense of trust within the organization. So I think one element is to come to the table with a good amount of data and knowledge to show that you know what you're talking about, right? So if you're sitting down with a particular function, make sure you understand the elements of their business. Now, you certainly don't have to know everything there is to know about a particular function, for example, marketing, but at least know how to talk to that group specifically. So again, I use the example of marketing, and if you were to come to a marketing group and come right out talking about cost savings, you're not going to gain that element of trust or partnership with that type of function. So it's really about understanding who you're working with, and if it's on a more specific area like a category, make sure you know a little bit about what's going on in the market and have that expertise, because that's going to give you a little bit of an edge when you're coming in, unknown.
Yeah, and I would add to that, like Jennifer said, focusing on quality and service is really important in addition to cost. And then also just identifying other value adds that procurement can bring, right? Like risk mitigation in their supply base, or service level guarantees that will make their lives easier down the road, as well as, best in class contract terms and things like that. The other thing that we see fairly commonly when there's a hesitance to bring procurement into the mix is timeline sensitivity. So having an awareness of, timeline constraints and being able to manage around those, and being flexible, frankly, with the process, and having a little bit of room for give and take in the process to be able to match the timelines, but still add value to the process and do all the types of things that you would be describing to them, like we just outlined.
Now, this is a great follow-on, I think, Dave. Jenn mentioned about showing up with data and having kind of insights around the category or insights around the supply market. And I know that there's an area that you talk about a little bit in the book, is market insights. So I just wonder if there's any tips on, where a procurement practitioner can go to find some of those insights, if they may not be readily available, or maybe it's a category that they're more of a generalist in rather than a specialist, so they don't know some of those insights just inherently.
Yeah, the one thing is I think people always hesitate to answer Google, right? But there's always the internet to do research and find, what others have been asking about, talking about, answering, and so on. The other one is, hard to ignore as well, is sometimes it's a good idea to bring in the right expertise, right? Like, so if there's a category where you don't have a lot of experience, or the market moves too quickly for you to keep up with, in the timeframes that you've previously looked at that given category. Sometimes the best and simplest solution is to bring in folks who have a lot of experience in that category, and kind of live and breathe it, and have the market insights and benchmark data to understand who the right suppliers are, what the right price points are, what the right terms and conditions would look like, what the right service levels would look like, things like that. So, just kind of two immediate top of mind answers. The DIY version might be, Google, the analysts, things like that, but there's always room for expertise to enhance your own internal team as well.
Now, in that first section about process, what I like at the end of that section is I really what not to do. And I'm going to focus on that because the working assumption is that a lot of the folks who are listening, have an understanding of what the process should look like, but are probably making some of those same mistakes of what you see on a day-to-day basis. So Bill, I'm going to kick this off with you. What are some of the things you observed that you would really encourage folks to avoid doing, or landmines to avoid?
Yeah, so that's Joe would point out is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I've written blog series and obviously a chapter in the book around it. But I think, if you were to really boil it down to one or two things, it's frankly to use some common sense versus being rigid with your process.
Yeah.
So far too often we see, because there's, let's call it a 7-step sourcing process, or because there's some sort of procurement policy that's been put place into your organization, we simply see some bad decisions being made. We see that major decisions are driven exclusively off of an analyst magic quadrant report, right? Because they feel, if it's in the upper right, I can't get in trouble if I made that decision. But that criteria for why they scored in the upper right might have nothing to do with your business. We see the biggest thing is we see that people take the RFP process or the RFI process, and they look to exclude vendors as quickly as possible, right? If you look at the most common RFIs or RFPs that you see from any organization, it starts with a bunch of questions that are meant for the suppliers to go away. What's your revenue? What's this? What's that? What's this? And all of them are disqualifiers. And I think the right approach to sourcing almost always is to cast the widest net as possible and really ask for the suppliers to come back with some creative solutions as to how we'll solve your challenge. And within that, inevitably you can find the most cost-effective ways to do that as well. Now, converse to that, you shouldn't always follow that sourcing process. If it's a highly commoditized thing and you really don't care, take that thing to market as quick as you can, bypass the RFP as quick as possible, bring the suppliers in and just do some direct sit down and negotiations with them. You really have to be flexible and not so rigid, but also just really use common sense. Why is this policy in place? Just because it's in place doesn't mean it shouldn't be challenged. And I think that's something really the most mature organizations probably struggle with most. Where it's, hey, this is the way it's always been done, or my policy doesn't allow me, or this is the RFP template that I'm being told to use. So it's really, take a step back and look at the exact situation and don't try and follow the same thing over and over and over again.
Now, having a process in place doesn't need to preclude you from being flexible. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how at an organizational level you can think about, based on what these situations, what the scenario is, or based on what's present, kind of an assessment up front, or at least seeing these are what the needs are. It can drive us into one sourcing process versus another sourcing process, as opposed to it just being a one size fits all.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, it's and that's what we see a lot, right? The same RFP template would be used for manufacturing versus buying IT services. Mm-hmm. Joe and I did a project, oh gosh, I don't want to say how long ago, but it was probably close to 15 years ago. And we had saw the very first thing we were evaluating the processes of another business. And the very first question in their IT sourcing initiative was, do you have any offices within 10 physical miles of our location? And they disqualified not only the top vendor, as it was scored by pretty much every Magic Quadrant and everything else out there, it was also the least expensive vendor. And they disqualified that vendor because the supplier their headquarters, in fact, was 16 miles away and fell right outside of the threshold. Right. So first of all, it made no sense whatsoever. It's IT services and hardware. The hardware is coming off a boat from another country, and the services are being delivered remotely anyhow. But because this policy was in place, they had to have a location within 15 miles of the main business entity. Mm-hmm. So we see stuff like that, and that's really, really key. The policies are meant to be the guidelines in many cases, and should not be so rigid that you can't deviate from them when it makes sense.
Yeah, I would add to that. It might sound strange coming from folks with procurement backgrounds, but it's similar to that idea that when you're a carpenter and you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I find a lot that when you're in procurement, everything needs an RFP. And that's when you think about the perception of procurement, both internally and with the supplier community, that lack of adaptability or flexibility really becomes a credibility issue. Mm-hmm. And you'll find that when you address situations that don't call for an RFP that way, you're going to see folks within your organization kind of question why things are being done that way. You're going to see suppliers bow out that would normally be eager to work with you and work with your organization. And ultimately, that rigid RFP process can lead to more of a hands-off approach by procurement, or a more formalized approach. And in certain situations, it's just not called for. You want strategic thinking from your suppliers. You want them to help you create a solution to a problem. And the RFP can't always help in those situations. So flexibility really becomes critical, and thinking logically about when to best use that versus some other sourcing process is really important.
Yeah, and I would just add one quick comment from a transformation perspective. I'd say that's probably one of the number one issues, complaints we get from stakeholders is they blame it on the threshold within the policy that we have to source too much. It's simply because of that. It's the improper application of that policy to the process.
Mm-hmm. So the next area within the book that you focus on is tech. And Joe, you'd mentioned about how much that has changed the landscape for procurement over the last 10 years or so since the first edition of the book. I'm going to come to you, Bill, and just ask you, from when there's an explosion of options today in technology, and it doesn't seem like there's a day that goes by when there's not more money that's coming into more startups in the procurement space. Like, how can the typical procurement leader or professional even get a handle on what's coming and what's relevant, what's not relevant, what to focus on, what's not to focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's interesting, there's certainly just an absolute slew of suppliers and vendors and new tech coming out every day, but I don't see that that's materially different than where it was 10 years ago. Okay. There was probably a little bit fewer organizations, new organizations popping up every year. But generally speaking, the technology stacks have matured to a degree, and I think there's more suite type players. So the suite type players are, for example, like Corcentric, where I am today, is that you have solutions that can take you through the entire source to pay lifecycle. And you're now starting to see a few of them kind of reach the top. There's probably about a half dozen of us that are really dominating the marketplace. And then everybody else is kind of a boutique, and the boutiques are highly focused, best in class for a particular solution, like sourcing or contract lifecycle management. And the reality is, there's not a right answer as to which one's the best fit for your organization, right? So every business, again, I'm not to attack the analyst community, but you need to really figure out what's right for your business. What's your current state of maturity? You don't want to go from an organization that doesn't really even have your policies and procedures figured out, let alone even have a procurement organization or a sourcing organization itself, and go right to an end state vision, which is a full ERP implementation and everything else. And the biggest risk of that, and of any IT acquisition really, is people tend to focus on the price of the product itself, the solution set itself, and completely ignore the biggest part of the equation, which is your implementation and all the advisory pieces to really understand how you should set a system up and everything else. So the thing I always like to look at is, we've done quite a few over my career of contract lifecycle management implementations. And when you go out and you find a really robust system, the first thing they're telling you to do is to figure out your approval workflow and your routing and your permission thresholds and all this other things on who can sign a contract and what the exceptions are. And I would argue, no, the first thing to do is figure out where your contracts are, right? They're probably in people inboxes and filing cabinets and on the shared drives in your computer and SharePoint. Start there and start to look at what your overall landscape of contracts look like. Also, if you do see yourself going with a full suite player in the future, there's nothing to prohibit you, if you choose the right full suite player, from still selecting a best in class individual solution. If you feel that for whatever reason, spend analytics, you guys need better analytics than anybody else because logistics is the heart of your business, then find a platform for your spend analytics that's compatible, and vice versa with a full suite player. So a full suite player can say, yes, you can integrate into me. Some of them are going to say, no, you have to use our analytics suite. So you have to really think about what you're trying to accomplish. But rarely is a big bang approach, I think, the right approach. It's often no different than ERP implementations would have been in the 90s and the early 2000s, where they frequently run 2 or 3 years behind schedule and potentially millions over budget. It's really no different when it comes to tackling procurement.
Yeah, I would just add, it's kind of interesting on that last point, Bill. It's it's procurement helps support all kinds of technology adoptions, and they're often pretty good at identifying all the types of things that Bill just described. When it comes to doing their own procurements, they get blinded by all the bells and whistles and just try to boil the ocean, and that's one of the biggest mistakes that you can make.
Now, do you find that, I'll open this question to any one of you, that the folks who are investing in more in procurement technology today are doing more so on that, let's take an iterative approach, versus let's go buy the full suite, spend the next 2 years implementing it, spend the millions of dollars in implementation fees? Are we going more to a slowly but surely and iterating than a big bang approach?
So it's all over the map would be my experience lately. We certainly are seeing a lot of adoption of the the best of breed providers, your sourcing applications, and truth be told, sometimes it makes some logical sense, right? You can in many cases fire up an instance with no integration and start running RFPs through it, right? But the reality is you can do that in some of the full suite solutions, like Corcentric solution, for example. So we definitely see that, but a lot of it's driven by the specific market need or the market size, right? But what we're also seeing is full suite players having multiple vendors of full suite providers in large organizations, and sometimes even medium-sized organizations. So I have observed that by business unit or even department, it's not uncommon for one business to have multiple different suites in there used by multiple different groups. And as well as a reluctance, good or bad, I think sometimes it is good, for the company to say, we're going to adopt a solution for the organization. We're seeing more and more, this is the right solution for my team or my organization. It may not fit for marketing. It may not fit for IT. So we're seeing a lot of that, and it's interesting to observe and see where that's fractured, how that's going to play out. But I've seen vendors play very well together within the same organization. But you also see the constant upselling and battling of the sales reps and everybody else trying to go in and say, well, we can replace everything here. But it is an interesting observation, I'd say, that probably didn't exist as much 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I would add to that, when we're talking to customers about their technology investment, what we try to do is tie it to the maturity of the function. Mm-hmm. So if you've got a decentralized organization and you're moving into a center-led or centralized procurement function as part of a transformation, the first technology you want to buy is spend analytics, because you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you don't have that insight into what you're spending today across the organization, you can't get to the next step. And then on the flip side of that, when you have a very mature procurement organization and you're trying to get them to the next level, either because they're, they've experienced diminishing returns, they've built their teams too big, they've gotten a category manager for every category down to things under $100,000, so there's no ROI there. Then it becomes about, okay, you need automation, you need streamlined processes. How can we move you into more of a P2P tool that automates a lot of what you do today and makes you more efficient? So there's all ends of the spectrum, and you really have to think about where your starting point is to figure out where's the best investment for technology.
Now, are you seeing more, when you think about the types of technologies that are coming more to the fore, that there is an increasing focus on self-service? How can procurement really enable the business and get out of the way? So it's kind of new. Well, I don't know if that's new technology, but more of an adoption or more of a mindset of self-service is a way to go for a procurement function, and therefore I'll find ways to enable it. Or is this just in what I'd consider more of the market leaders or the forward thinkers in terms of procurement really going down the self-service route?
No, I think that's a great observation. From a product perspective, we're certainly seeing the stakeholders of individual business units asking for visibility into what procurement's doing within a platform, and not just visibility, but extending that into the ability to edit events, approve events, if they're sourcing events or what have you, as well as control their P2P process a little bit better, take control of routing and approvals, and even handling the little minute things like Joe's going on vacation, who can approve while he's gone. These used to be things that were configured, hard-coded in by your third-party consultant firms, and they set and forget. And now you're starting to see individual stakeholders take more and more interest in being able to weigh into the processes, and really even self-initiate some of these exercises. You want to see a non-procurement person starting their PO requisition process and having that perhaps follow different pathways based on where the request is coming from, and how your business wants to route that request by dollar amount or business unit or what have you. You're starting to see non-procurement people very heavily involved almost on a daily basis in procurement platforms.
Which is an interesting contrast to where procurement was headed, right? Was trying to gain more control over procurement activity, right? But it does go back to the policy comment as well, where we're seeing the threshold for exposure to procurement activity go higher, allowing the business to buy more of those smaller purchases, and procurement having to let go a little bit of the control and trusting that they've instilled them with the right tools and governance to still make sure they're looking at diverse vendors, make sure they're following the third-party risk processes and all these different elements, because at the end of the day, who's still going to be accountable for that? It's a blend depending on the organization of whether or not the spend owner gets their wrists slapped or whatever, their hands slapped, or procurement is held accountable for those things. But it's about balance and trust. So I think the self-service component probably is coming with more mature organizations that have enabled that trust a bit more.
Yeah, it's interesting because kind of the beginning of the transformation journey a lot of the focus is on bringing in control. And we want to be able to, use spend under management as a metric, or whatever,
Right.
Whatever that means to whatever organization, depending on how you define it. But it's like at the beginning, we're trying to get control. And then when you maybe have been successful at doing that in certain categories of spend or certain areas and not in others, then it's like, okay, how do we devolve that back into the organization? And so for those that haven't necessarily started that transformation journey right now, should they be more thinking of how can I enable self-service from day one, as opposed to looking at, hey, I influence 100% of spend? Like, is that really the right thing for me to do as a procurement organization?
And I think that'd be a little bit difficult when you're starting on your journey and you have to focus on where you are today, but you still want to set that end state vision and you want to get there in a reasonable amount of time. How do you balance getting there with not getting there too quickly? And that's where the change management component really comes into play, right? Is understanding the culture of your organization and how quickly they can adapt. Because even if procurement can move quickly, doesn't mean the business is going to move with them. And that's where you start to get really imbalanced from a timing and implementation perspective with these different processes and technologies.
And one more comment I would add to that is it does really depend as well as to how the rest of the organization is trusting procurement, right? If your procurement organization has evolved, forget the technology for a second, if it's evolved to the point where other stakeholders from other groups say, hey, procurement brings me value, and if I engage them, perhaps my budget can stretch a little bit further this year, right? So if you're in that relationship already, it tends to make a lot more sense to bring them in and give them really the capability to influence their spend, because it's going to show more spend getting into the platform if they have that. If you try and tell them they have a part of it, but they don't really trust procurement yet, then they might use that as a mechanism to kind of end around the process, which conversely, does exactly the opposite of what you're looking to do.
So in the last section, there's a couple of different areas I want to touch on, at least that you wrote about in the book, which is around organizational design, but also kind of how you divide different types of projects based on their complexity. I'm going to start by asking you, Dave, around the complexity. There's low, medium, high complexity projects. We talked a little bit then about self-service, and trying to get perhaps some of those low complexity projects off our plate. But when you're kind of designing your organization, how should you be thinking about who or where is the best place in your organization to take projects based on their complexity?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting takeaway from the way that we outline that. So originally we had written some examples from the field, which were specific to categories, right? And this time we took a little bit of a different approach to it and described how we determine what the complexity of a given project might be. So where on the spectrum that you just mentioned a project may sit, and then how to factor that into your procurement roadmap. So when we think about the organization, your low complexity projects tend to be a little bit more tactical, a little bit more of a foregone conclusion, things like that. But the advantage of those types of projects is they're also very predictable. So from a staffing perspective, it gives you a really good feel for, what bandwidth you need to get a certain amount of your spend under management, what the balance of your bandwidth can go into your medium and your higher complexity projects, and also where you have some flexibility on both ends of that spectrum to ramp up or ramp down depending on when you get into those projects, you might learn that maybe there's more complexity here than we thought, or maybe there was a little bit less than we thought. And depending on what the answers to those types of observations are, you have some insight to draw from about what the priorities are when you're looking at your roadmap, but also how those priorities may be changing as you're executing against that roadmap, and you have flexibility to move resources around appropriately. So when you kind of look at that in kind of a big picture view, usually when you see that roadmap, you're going to have some concept of which resources on your team are best suited to the different projects, based on complexity, but also based on your the experience of the team, the subject matter expertise of the team, other priorities that they may have on their plates, things like that. So we really felt like understanding what project complexity is. There's a lot more to it than pure intuition based on experience. And as you can see, it's a really valuable insight to kind of the big picture planning, but then also being agile as you move through that execution.
Now, I want to follow up that, and I'm going to ask Jenn you a question about org design, because I think this flows into org design. One of the biggest, I don't know if pushback is the right word, when I'm talking to a lot of folks about their ability to make an impact within the procurement organization, and you're often doing this through when you're doing capability assessments and things like that, and you're hearing a lot like, I just don't have the bandwidth. I kind of know what I need to be doing, but I just can't get out of the low complexity projects. Doing renewals, day after day after day after day means I can't focus on anything. And when a big project comes up, I just don't have the time to dedicate to doing it the way it should be done. How should we be thinking about breaking free from that from an org design perspective? And are there different models that we can leverage that help procurement folks get out of doing some of the low complexity? Or should we have low complexity buying desk that just does that, that just churns those out so that some of the other folks on the team can be thinking about the more strategic or the larger projects? Like, how should we go about thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can go about org design, and the same as we've been saying all along, there's no right answer, or there's no perfect answer for every organization. Whether or not you go with more of a category management style structure, or something that we've been seeing more lately is the business partner concept, where in category management you're an expert in one particular area versus being touching across the entire process and being more of a partner to your stakeholder community, and both work really well in a particular environment. But I think what it comes down to, specific to what you were asking about, is properly segmenting the roles and responsibilities. And again, that can be a blended approach as well. We think about self-service, taking out some of those low complexity buys that tend to fall into procurement's lap. From a sourcing perspective, if the policy isn't crafted properly, they're spending so much time sourcing $1,000 purchase order. So it's a matter of blending the right governance model, but also making sure you have dedicated roles based on a particular skill set. So someone that might be spending more time doing strategic sourcing, you don't also want them processing purchase orders, because we know how that ends, right? All day they're processing purchase orders, and to your point, they never get to the more strategic activities. So I know having the right roles across the organization. I think the other challenge that comes with that at times too is getting the executive buy-in to create that segmentation, because they don't see the value in having enough individuals to do all those different things. And then what happens over time is, oh, well, this person can do 3 roles and now they can do 4 because we need to make the best of their time. So it can kind of run away with you from that perspective. So I think it really comes back to establishing the right business case for the procurement function, the way you want it to basically live up to with that end state vision, and the value they can drive by having a center of excellence and having a transactional team and a strategic team, for example.
Now, if a company doesn't have the scale to be able to separate, like having a transactional team versus a strategic team, maybe there's only 2 or 3 team members because it's a small growing group. Like, do you have any recommendations of how they should think about that? So at least compartmentalize, if you will, some of the tactical from strategic, so they can still focus on strategic and don't get overwhelmed with the tactical.
I think that comes down to having the right mix of tools available with the right processes, right? And this is something I've been experiencing lately, working with customers. Say, look, I have 3 people on my team. We want to do third-party risk. We want to do diversity. But there's only 3 of us and there's never going to be more. So how do we do that effectively? It's about having, on the risk side, for example, at least having some element of policy and process to govern what they're doing without going crazy. You don't need a fully robust program for indirect spend if it doesn't make sense in your industry. Diversity is a great place where you can just plug in some tools to make you more effective and show a lot of value by bringing those diverse vendors in. So I think it's all about having the right strategy and thinking about efficiency while still producing quality, and thinking about what the business needs most from procurement and focusing on that first.
Well, I know it's coming up to time to wrap up, so I'm going to head over to Joe for kind of the final word. There's so much material in the book. It's Managing Indirect Spend, Enhancing Profitability Through Strategic Sourcing, that we could probably have spoken, especially with 4 of us on the line here, for the next hour or so going into all the details. So I highly encourage anybody to get hold of it. If somebody wants to read the book, they've heard the interview, they'd like to know more, where would be the best place for them to find it?
The book is sold on Amazon, and we also have a website for it called managingspend.com, which will eventually take you to Amazon if you want to buy it. So you can check it out in either spot.
All right. Well, what I'm going to do is I'll just pop a link as well in the show notes for today's episode. Those are going to be artofprocurement.com/podcast, and that will direct folks to your website and to the Amazon site if they would like to pick up a copy. But finally, Joe, Bill, Dave, and Jen, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.